Hey kids, before we enter the Digiverse, I want to give a huge shout out to Garden Guardian, which just blossomed over on Steam and itch.io and presents a frantic throwback to the days of LCD gaming. You control Snippy, who has to keep an army of insects away from her beloved garden, razor-sharp shears in hand. Meanwhile, you still have to feed your plants and grow the garden, making for some tense, palms-is-sweaty style moments. Along with the escalating difficulty of the Endless mode, there's also a challenging Trials mission suite that offers various scenarios and modifiers to really spice things up. You can unlock a ton of art and concept designs, all for the low price of $3.99. If you're interested, check out the links in the description below and get to guarding that garden. With that said, let's start the show. Welcome back to another energizing and digitizing episode of What Happened, the show that says, hey, that thing over there, what happened? And today, that same question is going to be asked about the perpetually delayed Digimon Survive. Yes, Digimon Survive did finally come out earlier this summer, and if you somehow missed that, I honestly don't blame you. Survive was announced over 4 years ahead of release and released at the worst possible time, smack between the Live Alive remake, check out Liam and I's video over on Flophouse Plays, and Xenoblade Chronicles 3. In today's episode, I'll be exploring what we know about why the development for a game that was supposed to be a small-scale stopgap experimental spin-off took so long to digivolve onto store shelves. So allow me to pose the question once more. What happened to Digimon Survive? In July of 2018, Bandai Namco Entertainment announced that the next Digimon video game would be called Digimon Survive, but unlike the pair of Cyber Sleuth titles that had just been released, it would ditch the traditional RPG structure for something altogether different. It would put a heavy emphasis on visual novel gameplay to tell the story while offering a brand new tactical RPG battle system rather than the action or turn-based systems of prior games. Kazumasa Habu, the producer of most of the recent Digimon games, said to Famitsu that the impetus for Survive's change in direction was to offer an alternative to the Digimon Story and Digimon World series of games, and would lean into concepts from the various anime productions, with the most prominent being a stronger emphasis on the relationships between both human and Digimon.
Cut it out! Stop kissing my sister, you!
Shortly after Survive's formal announcement, Bandai Namco confirmed a Western release for the game on PS4 and Switch, with additional Xbox and PC versions set to ship outside of Japan, and reaffirmed that fans should expect it to launch in 2019. Aside from a few small tidbits, what followed was a very quiet year for Survive, with no new details on release information and no clear ramp-up in marketing. Fans started to worry as it was now well into 2019, and even if you discount the relative silence, they did have another potential reason to worry. While Namco was the publisher behind the Digimon games, Survive was being developed by an outside third party, and it wasn't even Cyber Sleuth's Media Vision, but an even more obscure studio by the name of Witchcraft, a support team who generally assisted on other, much bigger games. In fact, the only titles they had developed on their own were All Common Rider Revolution for the 3DS, as well as Prime Liam Bait Idle Death Game TV for the PlayStation Vita. They were still a young studio and a small team by most standards, so it's understandable that there was a certain amount of trepidation from fans during that first long bout of silence. Then, in April of 2019, Habu took to Twitter to assure fans that Survive was not cancelled and that there would be updates coming in the summer, which there thankfully was. The main dish was a 15-minute developer diary that shed light on some of the characters and aspects of the gameplay and story, which did a lot to help explain what the team was hoping to accomplish. It should be noted that this update spelt out very clearly what Digimon Survive was, a new take on the franchise which was focusing very heavily on storytelling and relationships, and significantly less on training and battles. This update also came with some unwelcome but expected news. Digimon Survive was getting pushed to 2020. Okay, so an initial delay for a relatively big game by a relatively small developer. Nothing weird about that, and surely nothing more to it, right? No, that would be very, very wrong. Behind the scenes, things weren't going as planned from a core development perspective, but the impending delay was also going to run them into further complications from one of the biggest monsters of all, digital or otherwise. So yeah, COVID-19 disrupted development of pretty much everything all across the world, and Japan was no exception. Things slowed down on a number of video game projects across the country, and I'm sure Survive was one such project. However, there was a far bigger disruption that the game saw, which was not immediately reported on. Digimon Survive's main development was being completely uprooted from Witchcraft in favor of another studio, Hide Inc., which was a move that Namco didn't really advertise and was only explained by Habu himself in more detail later on in 2022 through interviews with websites like One More Game. The team that was originally tasked with developing the game had worked on it for around 2 years before it was decided that a different approach was needed. Unfortunately, the data that was handed over to the new dev team was largely unusable, which meant the game essentially needed to be remade from scratch. Naturally, this led to a lengthy delay, with the initial projections of a 2-year development being extended to 4 years. The original dev team was developing the title on their own original engine, but as this was unavailable to the new team, the game needed to be redeveloped for the Unity engine. The new team has thus been fully dedicated to realizing the goal of creating a game that meets every one of the game's original targets in terms of quality.
It can't end like this!
Now, we're not privy to the exact reasons why it wasn't working out with Witchcraft, and it honestly could have been any number of factors, but what is clear is that when a publisher takes a huge risk like this, switching to a completely different studio and engine and effectively building the game a second time, they certainly must have had a good reason to do so. As Habu said, this was essentially hitting the reboot button and starting a new 2+ year dev cycle after completely canning the results of the last 2+ year dev cycle. Publicly, enthusiasm was starting to drain from a lot of all the Survive heads out there, and it was only going to get worse. In April 2020, Famitsu suddenly revealed that Survive was getting delayed indefinitely, dating it as a TBA in the release listing, which obviously was cause for concern, but was later confirmed by Bandai Namco US staff to be a typo. Regardless, way more people saw the initial headline rather than the correction, so fans were distraught/confused/angry at the development.
That's the saddest story I ever heard.
The situation was further muddied when in August, Toei Animation Japan, a co-owner of the Digimon IP and the producer of the series' various animes, updated their own release schedule, which indicated Survive was still on track for 2020 before updating their schedule again to define it as a 2021 game before just removing the date entirely. For a while, fans were left to their own devices to make sense of all this madness until Habu finally chimed in later that October, stating that Survive's development and release schedule was getting re-evaluated and that an official statement would be coming soon. On October 15th, that official statement was finally released on the Digimon Games Twitter account, with Habu clarifying, "The Digimon Survive team would like to extend our thanks to fans from around the world for their support during development, especially in these difficult times. We had originally planned to launch Digimon Survive in 2020, but current world events have shifted our development timing. We have made the difficult decision to push Digimon Survive's launch to 2021. We thank you all for your continued patience as we work to create a fun and engaging tactical RPG game, along with a memorable story for Digimon fans. We will share some exciting updates for Digimon Survive in spring 2021, so please stay tuned for more information." An unfortunate byproduct of all these delays is that to people who weren't paying close attention to the unusual development cycle, assumed Digimon Survive was either a disaster in waiting or some big epic game that kept getting grander and more ambitious, even if it absolutely wasn't. Like we discussed before, the game had switched developers and years were being spent rebuilding what they had, not drastically increasing its scope or feature set. What's more is that Hide Inc. was another small support studio and had contributed to games like Rune Factory 5 and Monster Monpiece, while their biggest wholly developed title was, as far as I can tell, Disney Fairies Tinkerbell and the Lost Treasure? They would then need to navigate the complex web of multiple paths, endings, and thousands upon thousands of lines of text common to most visual novels, along with designing this new tactical battle system as they made a game close to 60 hours of playtime if you sought to see it all. So, it's no surprise that in January of 2021, Namco and Habu decided to get in front of it for once and directly state that Survive would be delayed all the way into 2022, which, for what it's worth, was kind of a marked improvement in communication from what they had been doing before. Light was finally broaching the end of the tunnel in the early months of 2022 as signs of Survive started popping up in form of retailer release listings and ratings board updates, but it still took until June for a release month to be hammered down, which solidified over the next few weeks to July 28th in Japan and July 29th elsewhere. Also, the revelation that the game had switched developers only came to light at 2022's Digimon Con, or as I like to call it, Digimon Sci-Fi Con!
Be there and be square.
Where Habu himself finally confirmed it to fans. Up until now, it had been absolutely fair to assume this lengthy 4-year development time was to make a massive game, but here, finally, was the long-awaited context and reasoning for the delays at last. Now, while the road to release took a lot longer than anyone expected, Survive's journey ends on mostly, but not entirely positive notes. While most reviewers appreciated the slightly darker, less cartoony take on the world and characters, multiple outlets also felt the tactical gameplay lacked depth and felt very tacked on. While some thought the story had more depth and nuance than many other Digimon games before it, others felt the opposite, feeling it was poorly paced and only presented surface-level archetypes and themes. Regardless, the fact that it got generally a positive reception is a miracle for a game with such troubled development. We've seen a lot worse on this show. That being said, Survive was subjected to review bombing by fans for a variety of reasons, including the fact that the game that was always billed as a visual novel was a visual novel.
I hope you learned your lesson. Always save your receipts.
Many cited frustrations and confusion over the nature of its genre, lamenting the visual novel focus and the lack of training and evolution options, even though that was never on the table. That's like going out of your way to buy Mortal Kombat Shaolin Monks, but being pissed it's not a traditional 2D fighting game.
What's wrong with this picture?
While Survive's user score bounced back once fans got their hands on it and appreciated what it was doing, it can't be denied that the overall sentiment to Survive outside of Digimon circles has been somewhat muted. Sales-wise though, it's not a whole world better. Like I mentioned in the intro paragraph, Survive would be sandwiched between two other anticipated Japanese RPGs, a factor that surely hurt all three games somewhat, but probably mostly Survive. According to Famitsu's sales charts, it would sell fewer than 36,000 copies in its launch week across both platforms in Japan. It would fall off the charts after only barely passing 40,000 units. Steam Spy estimates peg Survive at somewhere under 79,000 users, but regardless, it goes without saying that these numbers aren't very good for a brand as established as Digimon. Furthermore, they pale when compared to the smash success of the Cyber Sleuth duology, where the original Japanese Vita-only release sold almost triple what Survive managed in Japan. The two Cyber Sleuth games would go on to sell over 1.5 million units worldwide, so yeah, that was quite the drop-off. This story is rather unique amongst the many I've covered over the years. A spin-off initially meant in part to fill the gap between much bigger entries winds up having one of the longest and most arduous life cycles, but still managed to eventually come out as a pretty solid game. It's certainly possible Namco and Habu might return to the idea of mixing up the Digimon formula even further, but it's safe to assume not in the same fashion, as the unique mix of visual and tactical gameplay only barely managed to survive its own journey onto store shelves.
Wait a minute, what am I laughing at? I'm supposed to be depressed!